Howdy, and welcome to Chapter 7. In Chapter 7, we're going to be talking about developing assessment instruments. We need to have some way for us to determine whether our learners actually learned what we set out to teach them, and assessments are developed for that purpose. So here's where we are in the Dick and Carey model. We've come a long way. We assessed the needs, we conducted an analysis, we analyzed our learners, and we wrote performance objectives. So now we're at the point where we're going to develop assessments based upon our performance objectives. And please note that we do this 2 steps before we actually start developing materials. And we'll talk in a minute why that is the case. So what is assessment? When we talk about assessment here, we're talking about criterion referenced assessment. It could also refer to this as learner-centered assessment or objective referenced assessment. And what this is an instrument composed of items or performance tasks that directly measure skills described in one or more of our performance objectives. So a criterion reference or objective referenced assessment is always linked to instructional goals and to an explicit set of performance objectives derived from those goals. So what do these assessments indicate? It indicates to the instructor exactly how well the learners were able to achieve each instructional objective. So this is important. It's an important part of the training that the instructor can have a way of knowing whether the learners actually learned what they set out to teach them. It also indicates to the designer which components are working and which have to be revised. If my personal experience, if I give an assessment or a question and let's say 80% of students don't get it correct, I can go back and say, well, there's either something wrong with the assessment or perhaps something is wrong in the way that I tried to teach it. Okay, so it tells the designer to go back that something isn't working correctly. So success on these assessments determines whether the learner has achieved the objectives in the instructional unit. That's what we're after here. So why do we develop these assessments before we do the training content? It seems a little counterintuitive that we're starting off with the questions or how we measure the skills versus how I'm going to teach the skills. But if you think about it and you think about the Dick and Carey model, it makes sense because the test items have to correspond one-to-one with the performance objectives. So once I have the objectives, it's much easier at that point to come up with the assessments. Okay. The performance required in the objective has to match the performance in the test item. So we look at the objective, we look at the performance in the objective, and then we write the assessment to match that performance. And that's much easier to do at this point. So the nature of the test items given to learners serves as the key to the instructional strategy. And next week we'll talk about instructional strategy, where we're actually laying out how we're going to teach something. So the test items inform how are we going to teach it. Okay, so kind of think about if an instructor were to create the content first and then try to fit the assessments within the framework of the content, we could lead to a disconnect between the objectives and the assessments. So this is why it's done in this particular order. It just forces designers to stay focused. Okay. Another reason is that sometimes when we're doing this, we all come with ideas and things we like and don't like. So if I tend to do the content first, I could concentrate on things that may not be real necessary to the training, things that I think are nice to know kind of things, but not really necessary. But by doing the assessment first, it allows the designer to focus on the content relating to the assessments and derive that from the objectives. So 4 different types of criterion reference tests. Okay, and we'll go over each one of these. So we have entry skills, we have pre-test, practice test, and post-test. So an entry skills test assesses whether the learner has the prerequisite skills necessary to be successful in the training. So it's given to learners before they begin instruction. And if you think of the flow charts that we've looked at, these are the skills below the dotted line. So we're trying to assess whether the learner has those skills that we are not going to be teaching in our training when they come into the training. So think about our semester-long case. What kind of entry skill might we give people coming in to make sure they have those skills beneath the dotted line? Okay. And we do this because if the learner doesn't have those, they'll have great difficulty with our training, and we may need to go back and send them to some sort of pre-training before they come into the training in order to make sure they're successful and have what it takes to do our training. Okay, the pre-test is given to learners before the instruction. And this is to determine whether they have previously mastered some or all of the skills that we're going to include. Okay, so we would give them the test sort of just over the total content of what we're teaching, just to see what do they already know. Okay, if all the skills have already been mastered, then the instruction really isn't necessary. Okay, if it's partially mastered, we can design it so we just review that part, and then we spend most of our time on the parts that the learners do not know. Okay, so from this entry skills test and pre-test, the designer then can decide, where learners should begin the instruction, whether the instruction is too simple, whether the instruction is really too difficult. So all those things can sort of be determined. And you may have done this in some classes. I know some instructors like to do this to measure how much knowledge you have at the end. So we'll have a pre-test and then a post-test at the end to measure knowledge. That's one way to use this, but in the design perspective, we're doing it mainly to see if our learners have, what knowledge they have going in to the learning. Okay, then we have practice tests. These are our tests given during the training where we can determine if the learner has learned what we tried to teach them, and it gives them a way to practice without it being like a high stake, sort of assessment. It allows them to practice and rehearse the new knowledge and see, do I need to go back and, look at this again? Do I know how to do this? Okay, so it allows learners to kind of judge for themselves where they are in the process, and if they need to go back and learn, relearn something. It also gives the instructor a chance to provide the learner feedback. For instance, this particular test item, if someone chose the wrong item, I would give them feedback and say, no, item B is, I'm not sure what item B is, but item B is this, and it's located here. Let's go back and review that. So it gives a chance for feedback. So the post-test is at the end, and this is following the instructions, and we want to see if they've mastered all the objectives, and particularly the terminal objective. So we're going to give this normally after the unit of instruction, after we've allowed them to practice and go back and relearn. So the main purpose is to really help the designer identify the areas that aren't working. Like I said, if I have a learner that takes a post-test and let's say most of the learners miss a question, I know there's a problem somewhere and I need to go back and fix that. So the main purpose is to assess whether the learner met the goals, but also to allow the designer to see areas that could be a problem. Okay, so designing assessments, and this is what we're going to do for this part of the project. You are going to design the assessments for your project. Okay, so when we design assessments, we match the learning domain with the item or assessment task type. So imagine what would happen if we didn't do this. For instance, let's say I have a psychomotor skill, like putting a golf ball. Let's say I'm making that up. Let's say that I give somebody a true and false question to see if they know how to do that. That wouldn't really match that particular objective because that's something that someone would have to do through practice or showing someone they can do. So you see, you have to match the learning domain with the type of question. A true or false question wouldn't be appropriate in that particular case. Okay. So here's a chart that is in your book. It just goes through the type of behavior. So for verbal objectives, we can use things like short answer, matching, multiple choice, so on and so forth. And even goals that are intellectual, we can very easily use multiple choice, as this says. But as we get into more performance-oriented goals where they have to actually, like I said, hit the golf ball or change a tire on a car, we may need to go to more, sophisticated ways to measure that. So it's just a very basic chart that shows you how you can do that. Okay, so we can find which type of assessment best matches the performance. Okay, so it's important that we have congruence in the design process. And what this means is kind of what I've been saying, that the test item needs to match the performance in the objective. And one great way to do this, and you'll do this in the project, is to do a design evaluation chart, because this allows us just a quick look across and be able to tell whether my performance objective is congruent with my assessment. And here's an example of one of those. So if I have locate purpose of policy, okay, that's, and the objective is given a computer, the employee will locate the purpose of the policy. So I have locate at least two purposes of the policy and copy and paste into the text box below. Okay, so you can see where that's congruent. Okay, state scope of policy. So here I can do a true or false. Okay, so you will do a chart like this, and you can just, like I said, look across and you can tell whether it's congruent. Well, that's it for Chapter 7. Thank you.